did you want to add anything to that comment or thought, Norm? Any feedback there?
Well, no. The only thing that I think is really interesting is you're talking about a different role for the public sector, and you're talking about an elevated role for the public sector. And when I've looked at successful infrastructure initiatives around the world, when companies really transform their infrastructure sectors, Spain, for instance, from 1995 to 2006, where all these giant companies appeared like ACS, or what happened in China, all sorts of different kinds of things happen. But one of the things that happens is trust emerges in terms of the public and private sectors, and in terms of engineering, construction companies, finance, and the public sector people, all getting along better, all having better lives, all getting stuff done quickly. That's one thing. The other thing that strikes me as I listen to Dan is that, our infrastructure system is so herky-jerky, it's unbelievable. So, one country that I was working with, European country, they have feasibility studies out 20 years, so a pipeline of projects. So if they get extra money, they have a waterfall of projects that they're going to work on. And, we're not allowed to do that. And I think that's a big problem. I think that's where the Biden initiative needs to hear people, especially people on this call from all over the country, to talk about how to think about a vision and some sort of a prioritization of infrastructure. And then the other part of it is the federal government needs to figure out how to play a role facilitating the process. The public sector's role isn't to block everything until there's no risk left. The public sector needs to facilitate, needs to drive innovation, needs to drive rapid, creative, imaginative, effective public investment in projects. It needs to, the rule-bound bureaucratic way of thinking about this simply doesn't make sense in an era of big data, when the people who have access to the data aren't actually at the top of the pyramid, they're in the middle of the pyramid. So it's really important to almost transform the way we think about infrastructure.
So I've got a couple of questions from the audience, and some of them were sort of answered, but I'm going to ask them outright. What do owners
questions twice?
What do owners need to do so they can best position themselves to be recipients of this estimated $2 trillion bill?
Well, I think it's pretty straightforward right now. We are in an age of, we're either going to return to earmarks or we're going to return to pseudo earmarks. And the best way to communicate with Congress is to communicate through specific project requests, whether you get those projects approved or not. First of all, if they're good projects, there's a good chance you're going to get them approved. So they'll become priorities. But the second thing is you're really educating the Congress, especially right now. And let's be very, very clear. The level of thinking about infrastructure, we're infrastructure professionals, right? That's what we do. We spend our time thinking about projects and how to get this stuff done. Think about, let's say your mind, let's say you're not over invested in infrastructure, but you're an infrastructure professional. So 50% of your time is spent thinking about infrastructure. How much of a congressman's time is spent thinking about infrastructure? Maybe 0.001%. So you don't really want to overwhelm this group of people with subtleties. You want to overwhelm them with, if we don't get this thing, it's going to be collapse, and that's going to be a problem for you. And I think that kind of, because what happens is we tend to be respectful, but what you really want to do is let them connect the dots as they hear from all sorts of people about what this country needs in terms of priority. And I understand, I'm sure people are going, yeah, I can't exactly do that because I have a boss and the boss has a boss and we're not allowed to communicate directly. But, I would say two things. One of them is Congress needs to do a much better job of creating channels to listen to people about infrastructure projects, and there are none right now. I mean, one of the good things, I suppose, about the year-long lockdown is I can Zoom all over the country to chambers of commerce, farmers groups, whatever, all the time. And the one constant is nobody listens to us, and there's no way for us to get our voice across. That's a big problem, and that's a vacuum that everybody is in the middle of right now. And almost, Dan, going back to one of the things that you said, I'm a big fan of state infrastructure banks, because I think what happens with an entity like that right now is that we're all siloed. I talk to my friends at the Department of Transportation here or someplace else, Department of Energy. Where does an electric vehicle sit, right? Does it sit in transportation? Does it sit in the Department of Energy? How do you get that approved? You have to go all the way up to the Secretary of Transportation and the Secretary of Energy, get them to talk so that you can have a joint research project. How long does that take? And if you were to create robust state infrastructure banks, again, this is a moment of dramatic change. State infrastructure banks that could bring in pension fund money, perhaps, that could fund feasibility studies, that could help to provide expertise, that could bring in technologists to give people a sense of how they could increase the performance of their jobs, increase the transparency in terms of what's going on. Do that without violating all the wonderful procurement rules that we've built up, so that DOTs around the country don't have free access to the kind of information that the private sector people have. I mean, this is a time where creating effective institutions, all of us working together, is absolutely critical. That's what happens when you go through such a giant industrial change as we're going through right now. I mean, a lot of the uncertainty around everything is because everything is moving. The forces that were pretty well set for the last 50, 60, 70, 80 years aren't set anymore.
So we have a funny question from the audience that I am personally interested in as well. And companies like Tesla are not going to like this question, but I'm going to ask it regardless. If you are thinking, or if I'm thinking, this is the person asking the question, if I'm thinking about purchasing, an electric vehicle or maybe adding solar to my home, should I be waiting for potentially a pending larger tax credit with this infrastructure bill? And then I'm going to add a second follow-up to this question is, what sort of presence will clean energy, clean sustainable energy have in this bill?
So
twofold. Tesla, if you're listening, please stop listening.
Yeah, no, I got that. Listen, I just bought a Tesla, and I bought it as a science experiment. I mean, I'm just fascinated by learning, right? I mean, I get to be the smart guy talking about all this stuff, and so buy an electric vehicle and figure out what the data looks like, figure out what a charging station looks like. Watch what happens when you pull into a charging station and you're doing pretty good, and then 7 other cars pull in and you're not doing so good anymore. You're gonna be there for the rest of your life rather than 30 minutes. I mean, all sorts of interesting things happen. So for me, I thought about that a little bit for about a nanosecond, and I said, just buy a vehicle, learn, because that's really what's going to happen here. So anyway, you're an early adopter. Congratulations. Look, the renewable energy piece is actually fascinating from my point of view, because, and I was talking to a guy in the White House 2 weeks ago, and I said, look, you guys are talking like it's 2016 or 2010 or 2012, 2008 in terms of renewable energy is almost being a tax on the system. It's no longer a tax on the system. It's where all the innovation comes from. It's almost competitive with everything else. If we have a carbon tax, it's going to blow everything else out of the water. So the real question with renewable energy is, how do you base load it? Probably through hydrogen. How do you base load it so it becomes reliable energy? And then how do you facilitate high voltage transmission lines so that it can get around the country easily, right? A friend of mine, Michael Skelly, went out of business trying to build windmills in Oklahoma, Texas, and then provide wind energy to the Midwest and to the east of the country because no one would allow him to build a transmission line. So we've got the private sector, which would love to toll electrons, can toll electrons. The figures are fascinating. I think we've built 3 DC high voltage transmission lines in this country since 1978, something like that. The Chinese did 12 last year, right? So you have to stop being an ostrich with your head in the ground. We have to stop that. Most of the people on this call are engineers, urban planners, people with a technical background. We know that we're not investing in the stuff that we should be investing in. And we also know that it's pretty straightforward to make those investments. So we've got to figure out how to get on with it for our children's sake and for our grandchildren's sake. That's the critical issue right now.
I know Dan has one last question, and I know we're running up against the time window, so we'll wrap on this.
Yeah, so
sorry for being preachy, Dan. I get carried away.
No, it's all good stuff. So really, this is around a general topic about sustainability, environmental impact, and making sure that there's equity in the distribution of these funds into, because a lot of this will end up going to the private companies to do all the building part of the new infrastructure. So any thoughts you have around balancing what we need, like you mentioned, the 12 lines put in 1 year by China. One of the things is, nobody owns property in China, so it's very easy. You don't need an eminent domain because the government owns it all. So you can put stuff into place very, very quickly. So, so striking the balance on environmental impact and then the equity component around making sure the money makes it to the maximum number of people possible.
So look, and I'll depoliticize the point by talking about a lot of my work overseas. One of the big problems in working on infrastructure internationally is that most infrastructure investment, the IMF has spent 30 years making it virtually impossible for governments to be able to make decisions, right? Because of public sector austerity. So a huge amount of private investment in infrastructure, or an increasing amount of infrastructure investment, tends to come from the private sector. But that's all IRR driven, right? So there's been virtually no extension of water, clean water, wastewater, et cetera, because you don't make any money off of that. Transit, almost nothing, because you don't make any money off of that. Somehow, I think one of the really interesting answers to your question, actually, I think it's an answer to both of your questions, Dan, is that we need to figure out, and we're actually building an algorithm, but we need to focus on benefits and on maximizing and measuring benefits, figuring out what those are, and then maximizing benefits to the consumers in the watershed of that particular infrastructure project, whether it's a renewable project or whatever. And part of it may be jobs, part of it may be carbon, part of it may be national security. Those are conversations that we need to have around infrastructure, and you have to open up the sort of the can of worms, because obscurity, darkness doesn't actually promote debate. And this is a really good opportunity for us to talk about what we really mean by benefit. Why do we do projects? Let's go back to where Evan started the conversation. Why do we do projects? We do projects to generate maximum benefits for citizens so they can have better lives, either professionally or personally. That's why we do projects. So the benefits of projects are obviously critical, and it's critical that everybody get equal access to, my dad used to say that he was born in 1913. So think about that. He used to say, we used to talk about opportunity, right? And that's what you're really talking about, is an architecture of opportunity. That's what infrastructure builds, and you've got to maximize that infrastructure of opportunity. So all the legacy stuff and the legacy arguments, I think those are dead ends. I think the conversation is, how do we get on with it, all of us together? And I think that's focusing on benefits and on a broad and pretty specific algorithm around benefits is pretty interesting. It's not going to be an easy conversation, but it's going to be a much more interesting conversation than the one we're having right now.
Norm, thank you so much for joining today's conversation. Where can people read more about your work, follow what you're doing? Feel free to plug whatever you wish.
Oh, well, I'll plug my book.
I love it.
Our Strategic Infrastructure Roadmap Forward. Please, let's set a record today and download the book. It's less than $10 on Amazon. How do you like that? Or you can send an order for me for $25 and I'll send you a signed copy. So there you go. But you know, on a more serious level, we've started something called the Strategic Infrastructure Performance Institute, a not-for-profit, and I'd love to get as many public sector participants engaged in this as possible, because the whole point is to focus on how to prioritize projects, how to think about innovation, especially technology innovation in our infrastructure, and then how to think about more imaginatively about how to fund our infrastructure, especially with a long-term view so that we don't put an unnecessary burden on the future. So as much as I can do to, you know, we're really facilitators in the sense that we want to build projects, but we want to make sure the country goes first. It's this idea of if you build a common good, then everybody's going to have a better chance to have an individual good. That's really what we're all about. So anything we can do to facilitate that, super happy to do it.
Thanks again, Norm. This concludes our 1 year later webinar series. This was the third of 3 episodes. Thanks again to everybody who tuned in, asked questions, participated in our Q&A sessions. We're so grateful for each of you. Like we said, you will receive a certificate of completion in your email, and it will be available on the eBuilder website after this is concluded. So thanks again, Norm. Thank you, Dan, for participating in today's conversation. It's going to be an exciting few months in Congress. I know it is going to be a lot of back and forth. So thanks again, Norm, for joining today's conversation. And everybody, we'll see you next time.